Hello, and welcome to Music and Art in the Catholic Tradition, Module 1, Lesson number 3. Today we're going to be talking about St. Augustine's On True Religion, jumping ahead into the early Christian era, into the era of the Church Fathers, and we're going to be looking specifically at the passages on True Religion that exemplify what St. Augustine thinks beauty is, and where he thinks beauty comes from. So, let's get started with a little bit of info on St. Augustine. St. Augustine lived in the 4th century A.D. Actually, from the 4th century into the 5th century A.D. So, approximately 1,000 years after Plato and Aristotle. So, while it may seem like we've jumped quite a bit in history from the 4th century BCE to the 4th century AD, we've already covered the most influential Greek philosophers, that is, of course, Plato and Aristotle, and you don't just have to take my word for that. As we go through the course, we'll see that it's really their ideas, translated sometimes through many other later philosophers, that remain in the Catholic tradition, some of which may be to the very present day. Who knows? We'll have to see. But anyway, On True Religion is just one of a number of works by St. Augustine that we can look at and examine his aesthetic perspective. But it happens to be one of the most obvious in terms of figuring out what St. Augustine actually believed. So let's start with his perspective on beauty. If you look at the very first page, the very first excerpt page from On True Religion, he writes, "The source of pleasure in any art is harmony, which alone is responsible for the beauty and wholesomeness of all things. At the same time, harmony aspires to equality and unity, either through the similarity of even parts, or through a regular progression of uneven." So here, we're already getting something that sounds very familiar, right? The source of all pleasure, or the source of pleasure in any art, is harmony. And of course, harmony was an important aspect of beauty both for Plato and for Aristotle. Specifically, a harmony that lies in order and unity and good proportion. And that's what he's talking about here when he says harmony aspires to equality and unity either through similarity of even parts or through a regular progression of uneven. So in a regular progression of unevenness, that will be a proportional progression. The similarity of even parts will again be a equal, harmonious, proportional relationship between the two. Harmony and equality and unity. He also says, at the end of the excerpt, beginning at the end of page 3, he's talking to a person who he describes as a beholder of inward things who sees the unseen. So if he were to happen upon a beholder of inward things and ask them what is beautiful, he writes, "And first I will ask whether things are beautiful because they please, or please because they are beautiful. Without any doubt, I will get an answer that they please because they are beautiful. I will further ask, what is it that makes them beautiful? If he, that is, the beholder of inward things, hesitates, I will add a hint. Is it because they have equal parts that come together in such a way that they form one harmonious arrangement? Once this becomes clear to him, I will ask, do these things attain this unity in its highest form? For, as we found out, they are striving for it. Or are they still far inferior to it, and only somehow pretend to it?" Indeed, who would not see, after some pressure to think about it, that on the one hand there is no shape or body whatsoever that does not have some trace of unity, but that on the other hand, no matter how beautiful a body is, it cannot attain that unity it strives for, because its parts are necessarily spread out in space over different locations. And so what he's getting at here is sort of the same thing as he said before. The harmony, the beauty lies in the harmonious arrangement of the parts, the constituent parts of anything, a dog, a painting, a piece of music, a building. And he goes on to say that do these things attain their unity in its highest form? So are they completely beautiful, or are they inferior and are only in a way pretending to beauty? And he says, of course, everybody would see that the things that we're seeing are not perfect, but that they're simply representing, a level of harmony, a level of unity, a level of equality, and that in as much as they have that harmony or equality, they are beautiful to that degree. So everything has a certain amount of unity. Even ugly things have a certain amount of unity, but they don't have as much unity as things that we would consider beautiful. But even those things that we consider beautiful don't have perfect unity. And so that leads us, if we ask the question, what is perfect unity? What is this perfect unity that he's talking about? That leads us to the next item that we're going to discuss today. And this goes very intimately back to Plato, and we'll get to talk a little more about Plato's aesthetics that we didn't have time for last time to go into as much detail. So, the question, where does beauty come from? How does St. Augustine answer this? Well, he writes, if we flip back to the first page of the excerpt, he writes, "Indeed, all sensual beauty, either natural or enhanced by the arts, is beautiful in a spatial and temporal sense, as, for example, the body and its movements. At the same time, that sort of equality and unity that is grasped by the mind alone, and according to which one makes judgments about corporeal beauty through the mediation of the senses, neither changes shape spatially nor fluctuates in time." And he calls this a perfect standard. And even before that, he writes, "True equality and similarity, as well as true unity itself in its original form, cannot be perceived by the eye of the flesh, nor by any bodily sense, but can be contemplated by the mind alone." So what he's saying here is that all sensual beauty, all the beauty that we partake of through our senses, is fleeting. It's spatially and temporally fixed. So there's a time and a place for this beauty. And it's not perpetual. It's not immutable. It changes, it degrades, it disappears. And there is such a thing behind this beauty, this sensual beauty, as a perfect unity, as a law of equality. And this perfect beauty can only be contemplated by the mind. So, for St. Augustine, we see something that looks beautiful. And in our mind, we contemplate that beauty. And it's in our mind that we can contemplate what the perfect example of that thing would be, and how that thing that we're seeing in the physical world matches up to that perfect model, that perfect standard. He goes on to say on the second page, he goes on to talk about, we compare round things to an ideal roundness, and it applies to all round things, and it's only in our mind that this round ideal exists. And similarly with squares, we compare square things to an ideal square, which doesn't actually exist anywhere but in our mind. Now he goes into greater detail about what is this perfect standard, this perfect unity, or this law of unity that he talks about. And he writes, at the bottom of page 2, "Now this law that governs all the arts is absolutely immutable, At the same time, the human mind, which enjoys the benefit of perceiving this law, can err and undergo change. It is sufficiently clear, then, that that law, which is called truth, is above our mind. So he's saying this standard that we perceive in our mind doesn't exist in our mind only because sometimes we can make mistakes and err in the way we judge whether or not something is perfect. This law of unity he calls truth. And this truth, he says, exists outside of our mind. So it's something higher than us. And indeed, on the very next paragraph, he tells us another way to describe this exemplar, this model, this perfect standard, this truth. He writes, "Nor should there be any doubt that immutable nature, which is positioned above the rational soul," so the thing that's above us, beyond us, this truth that's beyond us, is God, and that this highest wisdom is also the highest life and being. For this is precisely that immutable truth that is rightly called the law of all the arts, as well as the art of the almighty artist. So in St. Augustine's conception of beauty, there exists sort of a ladder of beauty. At the very top is the truth, is God. And from this truth and from God, from this immutable, unchangeable ideal, the beauty of all things below it come about. We conceive of this beauty in our mind, but it's not perfect in our mind because our minds are imperfect. Only God is perfect. And then below us are the things which we're perceiving, pictures and dogs and trees and music. And those things are beautiful inasmuch as they reach towards that unity, that proportion, that harmony that lies behind them, that they are reflecting outwards in their shape, in their physical manifestation. Now, St. Augustine doesn't take this purely out of thin air. It's not his own original idea. The aspect of it being deriving from God may be, but the idea itself goes back to Plato, in Plato's idea of the forms. So we've talked about the soul, or the fundamental resonating frequency, or the ideal of something in Plato, and that the more something corresponds to the ideal, the more it's ordered, the more it's proportional, the more it's in harmony, the more accurately, to use Aristotle's perspective, the more accurately it imitates what it's imitating, the more beautiful it is. Another way we can say this, and the way it's presented by Plato, is that each thing that we see in the world is just a representation of what he called the forms, a perfect form which lies behind that thing that we're seeing. It's the reason why when we look at a dog, and then later we look at another dog, we can tell that they're both dogs. In the same way that when we listen to a piece of music, and then we listen to another piece of music later, we can tell that they're both pieces of music. Because there's a form that lies behind them which is perfect and immutable and unchanging. And we can be aware of that. And we judge things based on their aptness in relation to that form. And so really, St. Augustine is saying the same thing here. He's saying that things are beautiful when the more they are harmonious, the more they represent truth. And that truth for St. Augustine comes from God, but the truth for Plato comes from the forms which lie behind the matter that we see. And so, even though there's a different origin for beauty in their conceptions, one is pagan and one is Christian, they both fundamentally believe the same thing about where beauty comes from. And they also believe fundamentally the same thing about what beauty is, this harmony, this unity. And so, already we're seeing in the very earliest Christian writers, one of the most influential church fathers, St. Augustine is, a very closely allied aesthetic system to that of Plato and Aristotle. And we'll continue to see that as we move forward, chronologically, in more ways than one. So, that is Lesson 3. Please let me know if you have any questions. And I look forward to discussing this with you in the discussion board and continuing our conversation in Lesson 4. Until then, I'll see you next time, and have a great day wherever you may be.